World War II was a war of technology. It gave us game-changing innovations like radar, penicillin, and the dawn of the computer age. We think of these as the defining technologies of the war, but that's not the whole story. For every successful invention, there were dozens of bizarre, creative, and utterly failed experiments dreamed up in desperation. And tonight, we're looking at the absolute craziest of them all, the attempt to build a flying tank. You heard that right. The idea of merging the violent power of a rolling fortress with the mobility of an aircraft wasn't just a fantasy. It was a serious military project pursued by multiple nations. In this video, we'll uncover Germany's monster gliders, Britain's strange winged experiments, and the ultimate expression of this insane idea, the Soviet tank that literally grew wings. This is the saga of how World War II engineers tried to make tanks fly, and why it was a spectacular failure. So, you're a military planner in World War II. You have a problem. Tanks are heavy, and moving them to the front lines quickly is a logistical nightmare. How do you get your armor behind enemy lines? Germany's answer was characteristically extreme. Build a glider big enough to carry a tank. This was the Messerschmitt Me 321, nicknamed the Gigant, the Giant. And they weren't kidding. This monster was built from a steel tube frame and covered in fabric to save weight. Its nose was a massive set of clamshell doors that opened to swallow an entire tank, or up to 200 soldiers. But its sheer size created a new, terrifying problem: getting it off the ground. No single plane in the Luftwaffe was powerful enough to tow it, so they came up with a solution called the Troika Schlepp, a triple tow. 3 separate Bf-110 heavy fighters would take off in a V formation, all tethered to the same giant glider. It was an incredibly dangerous maneuver. One incident led to a collision that killed 129 people across all 4 aircraft. The Troika Schlepp was so risky that they eventually built a dedicated tow plane, the Heinkel HE-111Z Zwilling, a bizarre 5-engined aircraft made by Frankensteining 2 bombers together. But even with these extreme measures, the Gigant was slow, vulnerable, and saw very limited use. It was a monumental effort for a weapon that was simply too impractical for the battlefield. But if building a giant glider for a tank was too complex, the British had another idea. What if you just attached wings to the tank itself? British engineer Leslie Everett Baines proposed a design for a massive glider with a 100-foot wingspan that would be mounted directly onto a tank. The tank would act as the fuselage. Once it landed, the crew would simply detach the wings and drive off into battle. A small 1/3 scale prototype called the Baines Bat was actually built and flown in 1943 to test the tailless design. And while the small prototype flew reasonably well, the project was cancelled. A major problem was that there were no British tanks light enough to be carried by the proposed full-scale glider. The idea was simply too ambitious for the technology of the time. But that wasn't the end of British experimentation. They also developed the roto-buggy, which attached rotor blades to a jeep, attempting to create a flying off-road vehicle. These British and German projects showed just how obsessed engineers were with this concept. But one nation took the idea to its logical and most absurd conclusion. If you want a flying tank, why not just build a flying tank? This is the Soviet Antonov A-40 Krylya Tanka, or tank wings. It wasn't a glider carrying a tank, it was a tank that was a glider. In 1941, aircraft designer Oleg Antonov was ordered to design a glider for landing tanks. His ambitious solution was to create a detachable cradle with large wood and fabric biplane wings and a twin tail that could be bolted directly onto a standard T-60 light tank. The plan was simple. A heavy bomber would tow the winged tank into the air. Once released over the battlefield, the tank's driver, now a pilot, would glide it to the ground. Just before landing, he would start the tank's engine to get the track spinning, land on the treads, jettison the wings, and be ready to fight within minutes. To make it even remotely possible, the T-60 tank had to be lightened significantly. Its armament, ammunition, and most of its fuel were removed. Even then, its only test flight, on September 2, 1942, was a near catastrophe. Towed by a TB-3 bomber, the A-40 was so heavy and created so much aerodynamic drag that the bomber's engines began to overheat. The tow plane struggled to gain altitude and couldn't get above 130 feet. Facing a potential crash, the bomber pilot had no choice but to cut the flying tank loose prematurely. For one brief moment, the A-40 was flying on its own. The test pilot, Sergei Anokin, managed to glide it smoothly and land it safely in a field. He then simply drove the tank, wings and all, back to base. But the verdict was clear. The project was abandoned because the Soviets lacked any aircraft powerful enough to safely tow the winged tank at the required speed. The dream of a flying tank had officially crashed and burned. So there you have it. Germany's giant gliders, Britain's winged experiments, and the Soviet Union's absurd but brilliant A-40. But the flying tank wasn't the only weird weapon of World War II. The Allies also developed a plan to strap tiny bombs to bats and release them over Japan. Stay tuned for that video. If you think a flying tank is strange, you haven't seen anything yet. Thanks for watching. Like, share, and subscribe, and comment for Bat Bomb video. Thank you. Have a nice day.